right, good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming down tonight. We are live from Books and Books in Coral Gables, Florida. So a note for our internet audience watching at home, if at any time during tonight's event you'd like to purchase a copy of the book, you can call the number on your screen. We will take care of that for you. We will have the author sign it, and we will have it shipped to wherever you are in the United States free of charge. For those of you who are watching from overseas, the shipping might be just a little bit more. Well, this evening, Books and Books is very happy to present Ms. Roxane Gay and her acclaimed new novel, An Untamed State. Ms. Gay is going to be in conversation with a good friend of Books and Books. She is an author and the director of the Creative Writing Program at the University of Miami, Ms. Evelina Galang. They'll tell you all about it. Please give a very warm welcome to Roxane and Evelina.
I'm going to introduce you from here.
Hey,
all right.
Excellent.
Because we've got Mike. Okay. So a year ago, I sat in the audience at the University of Miami, and I listened to Roxane Gay read from her book of stories, IT. She played to a typical Miami student body of Caribbean students of Caribbean ancestry. Students dying not only to read, but to meet a contemporary artist writing stories they might identify with. I was immediately drawn to Roxane Gay's down-to-earth presentation, the way she spoke to the students plainly, like a friend, and delivered a single story that would probably make them fans for life. If you look closely at the work of Roxane Gay, you'll see you won't have to look closely at all to see her name in any venue that a writer might dream of being included in. Flavor Wire has named her one of the 25 women to lead the culture. She is not only a prolific writer of fiction and nonfiction. In her work at Salon, The Rumpus, and the Wall Street Journal Speakeasy Culture blog, among other places, she is a cyberspace guru taking the form of creative writing into digital media spaces beyond our traditional understanding of what it means to be a writer. She has made it her mission to bring the literary works of writers of color to the attention of reviewers and readers alike. Last March, at the AWP Annual Writers Conference in Seattle, Roxane Gay's name was the buzz everywhere. I heard someone talking about you in the bar, like in a really good way.
That happens a lot of bars. What can I say?
On panels, she was on, which I went to a couple of those, and those she was not on. Roxane Gay's fiction and creative nonfiction deals with women and men and the complicated ways they love each other, sex and violence, and the challenges of representation. Through her, though her creative interests are certainly not limited to these subjects. Her stories are grounded in dirty realism, but her writing also embraces magical realism. Once, Roxane Gay said of her writing, "I write explicitly and intimately, and have been referred to as fearless, which I am. I go all out. I cannot imagine writing, reading, or teaching any other way." Tom Perrotta, author of Little Children in 9 Inches, says, "An Untamed State is a harrowing, suspenseful novel about the connections between sexual violence and political rage, narrated in a voice at once traumatized and eerily controlled. Roxane Gay is a remarkable writer, an astute observer of Haitian society, and a deeply sympathetic, unflinching chronicler of the compromises people make in order to survive under the most extreme conditions." Roxane Gay's writing has appeared in Best American Short Stories 2012, Best Sex Writing 2012, Oxford American, American Short Fiction, I heard you giggling out there, West Branches, Virginia Quarterly Review, Noon, the New York Times Book Review, Book Forum, Time, the Los Angeles Times, The Nation, she's prolific, right? The Rumpus, Salon, the Wall Street Journal Speakeasy Culture blog, and many others. She is the co-editor of Pank, an essays editor for the Rumpus. She has recently accepted a post at Purdue University and will be the visiting writer at Florida Atlantic University in the spring of 2015, right?
Correct.
Tonight is the Miami launch of Untamed State, her debut novel, and in August we look forward to her book of essays, Bad Feminists. You will probably want to pull out your phones and tweet tonight away, for she says many a remarkable thing on the fly. She does. One nugget she passed on last March was this one. When you put someone in the light, they will be seen. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and welcome Roxane Gay as she steps into the light.
Well then.
So go for it.
Thank you, Evelina.
You're welcome.
That was excessive.
So happy to have you here.
I'm happy to be here.
You're awesome.
I am.
Do your thing.
Thank you very much. That was very kind of you.
Do you want to stay here or you want to go?
I think here is great.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll just be quiet now.
Oh, sure. Should I read maybe a couple chapters?
You want to read a little bit?
Yes.
Yeah. And we'll talk about it.
Yeah, why not? I think that's why I'm here. So I wrote a book called An Untamed State. It came out last Tuesday. And it's a novel about a young woman who's visiting with her American husband and infant son in Port-au-Prince when she's kidnapped. And she's held for 13 days because her father is reluctant to pay the ransom. He worries that if you pay one kidnapper, you're going to end up having to pay them all. And so the novel looks at her life before, during, and after her kidnapping, and how she tries to overcome her father's betrayal, and how she comes to terms with understanding a country she never really knew. And so I thought I would read a few chapters. This is the first chapter. Once upon a time, in a far-off land, I was kidnapped by a gang of fearless yet terrified young men with so much impossible hope beating inside their bodies. It burned their very skin and strengthened their will right through their bones. They held me captive for 13 days. They wanted to break me. It was not personal. I was not broken. This is what I tell myself. It was hot, nearly 100 degrees, the air so thick it felt like warm rain. I dressed my son, Christophe, in a pair of miniature red board shorts and a light blue T-shirt with a sailboat across the front. I covered his smooth brown arms and his beaming face with sunscreen. I kissed his nose and brushed his thick curls away from his face as he pressed his palms against my cheeks and shouted, "Mama, Mama, Mama." My husband, Michael, the baby, and I said goodbye to my parents and told them that we would be back in time for dinner. Michael and I were taking Christophe to the ocean for the first time. We were going to hold him in the warm salt water as he wiggled his toes and kicked his chubby legs. We were going to throw him toward the sun and catch him safely in our arms. My mother smiled from the balcony where she watered her plants, wearing a crisp linen outfit and high heels. She blew a kiss to her grandson. She reminded us to be safe. We put our son into his car seat. We handed him his favorite stuffed animal, a little bulldog named Baba. He clenched his beloved toy tightly in his little fists, still smiling. He has his father's temperament. He is usually happy, and that is important to me. Before getting into the car, Michael double-checked that Christophe was strapped securely in his car seat. He put our beach bags into the trunk. Michael held my door open, and when he closed it, he pressed his face against the window and blew air until his cheeks filled. I laughed and pressed my hand against his face through the glass. "I love you," I mouthed. I don't say those words often, but he knows. Michael ran around to his side of the car. After he slid behind the steering wheel and adjusted the mirror so he could see the baby, he leaned into me and we kissed. He rested an arm on the armrest between us, and I idly brushed the golden wisps of hair on his arms. I smiled and rested my head on his shoulder. We drove down the long, steep hill of my parents' driveway and waited quietly for the heavy steel gates, the gates keeping us safe, to open. In the back seat, Christophe cooed softly, still smiling. As the gates closed behind us, 3 black Land Cruisers surrounded our car, the air filled with a high-pitched squealing and the smell of burning rubber. Michael's tan knuckles turned white as he gripped the steering wheel and looked frantically for a way out. His body shook. The door of all 3 trucks opened at the same time, and men we did not know spilled out, all limbs and gunmetal. There was silence, the air thin, still hot. My breath caught painfully in my rib cage. There was shouting. 2 men stood behind our car, machine guns raised. Michael pressed his foot against the gas pedal to move forward, but a tall man with a red bandana across the lower half of his face, a man holding a machine gun, pounded his fist on the hood of the car. He left a small dent in the shape of his closed hand. He glared at us and then raised his gun, pointed it directly at Michael's chest. I threw my arm across my husband's body. It was a silly, impotent gesture. Michael's eyes were bright, and bright arcs of tears trembled along his lower eyelids. He grabbed my hand between both of his, held me so fiercely it felt like all those slender bones would be crushed. Two men slammed the butts of their rifles against the car windows. Their bodies glowed with anger. The glass cracked, fractures spreading. Michael and I pulled apart, waiting tensely, and then the windshield broke, the sound loud and echoing. We covered our faces as shards of glass shattered around us, refracting sharp prisms of light. The baby was still smiling, but his lips quivered, his eyes wide. My hands could not quite reach him. My child was so close, my fingers thrummed. If I touched my child, we would all be fine. This terrible thing would not happen. A man reached into the window and unlocked my door. He started to pull me out of the car roughly, growling as the seatbelt held me inside. After he slapped my face, he ordered me to unlock my seatbelt. My hands shook as I depressed the button. I was lifted up and out of the car and thrown onto the street. The skin covering my face stung. My body deflated. My body was just skin stretched too tightly over bone, nothing more, no air. The man sneered at me and called me diaspora with the resentment those Haitians who cannot leave hold for those of us who can. His skin was slick. I couldn't hold on to him. I tried to scratch, but my fingers only collected a thick layer of sweat. I tried to grab onto the car door. He slammed his gun against my fingers. I yelled, "My baby, do not hurt my baby." One of the men grabbed me by my hair and threw me to the ground. I gasped as I wrapped my arms around myself. A small crowd gathered. I begged them to help. They did not. They stood and watched me screaming and fighting with all the muscle in my heart. I saw their faces and the indifference in their eyes, the relief that it was not yet their time. The wolves had not yet come for them. And so she's taken to a hideout and held for 13 days. And while she's being held, she starts to reflect on her life before the kidnapping. And so this is a chapter where she and Michael are visiting Port-au-Prince for the first time. Michael and I took our first trip to Port-au-Prince after dating for a year. Michael insisted on meeting my parents, and I tried to prepare him. I explained how he would see things he might never see in the States. I explained that he would see difficult and painful things. I explained that there is nowhere in the world both as beautiful and as ugly, as hopeful and as hopeless. I tried. I hoped he would understand that he could not love me without loving where I am from. In the weeks before our trip, Michael read travel books and surfed the internet and took notes. He'd point to a hat and say, "Le chapeau," and in the driveway, he'd pat the hood of the car and say, "La voiture," and when we woke up in the morning, he'd say, "Je t'aime," the words always sounding square and strange, wrapped in his thick Midwestern accent. It was very charming. We had a lot of sex. He filled an entire suitcase with bottled water. As I watched him packing, I said, "What the hell are you doing?" "I don't want to get sick," he said. "We're not going off the grid, Michael. My parents have plenty of water. That's all we drink." He shook his head and zipped his suitcase shut. "Just in case," he said, patting his bag proudly, like he was making an intelligent decision. Miami International Airport often feels like Port-au-Prince. It is crowded and hot and forever under construction, though nothing seems to change. Everyone is irritable and sweaty and talking too loudly, often trying to carry too much to some country where the people have too little. As we stood in line, Michael kept tugging my sleeve, whispering into my ear loudly, "Look at that suitcase. Look at that suitcase. How are these people going to get on the plane?" I laughed. I said, "The rules are different for these flights. Haitians ignore the rules anyway." He rubbed his chin thoughtfully and started taking pictures with his phone. We sat in first class and Michael grinned like a little boy. It was his first time. I squeezed his hand. His smile always brings out the best in me. Michael had a happy childhood, and that helped him become a happy man. My parents love that about him. They love his joy, his red cheeks, and his easy smile, the way he is not intimidated by anything. They call him Mr. America. I tried to ignore my nervousness. I talked fast, so fast, trying to remind Michael of all the things he should and should not do. He said, "Relax, babe, I have met the parents before." I leaned back and I said, "You have not met the Haitian parents." As we descended into Port-au-Prince, we switched seats and Michael stared down at the beautiful blue water and then the Capitol sprawling in from the edge of the island. "Are you ready for this?" He nodded eagerly and I hoped for the best. We walked across the tarmac, white heat billowing around us in waves. By the time we reached the terminal where the air conditioning was not working, Michael was dripping in sweat, his hair clinging to his red face. We waited in customs for what seemed like hours, the line shuffling forward with people cutting at random or clustering when they saw someone they recognized or when they simply wanted to improve their chances of ever getting out of the airport. Michael wiped his forehead and shook his head. "This is insanity." I held his arm and I said, "Baby, this is the easy part." At baggage claim, my parents' chauffeur, Nelson, waved to us eagerly. When he tried to take Michael's suitcase, Michael said, "I've got this," and Nelson frowned. "Let him take your bag," I said. Michael let go of the handle and shifted uncomfortably. A fresh bead of sweat trickled down his neck. We followed Nelson through a throng of people gathered near the airport entrance, cab drivers trying to grab tourist bags to hijack fares, vendors selling Haitian flags and straw hats, armed police trying to keep the chaos to a dull roar. Dozens of young men stood behind a fence shouting to people they recognized and strangers alike. The drive to my parents' house was long and bumpy, the sun-scorched concrete of Port-au-Prince stretching around us. Nelson spent most of his time with one hand on the horn and one arm hanging out the window so he could gesture angrily when someone cut him off or otherwise got in his way. I stared at Michael as we drove, saw his wide-open eyes and how he seemed to be holding his breath. Everything was as I remembered, dirty and broken, until we entered my parents' neighborhood and the city quieted. The streets were cleaner, more orderly, the cars nicer, the concrete walls towering even higher than the homes themselves. Michael relaxed visibly, loosened his grip on my hand. At the gate, at the foot of their driveway, Nelson honked the horn and slowly the steel gates opened. We drove up a long, narrow drive. As the house came into view, Michael said, "Holy shit, this is a castle." And I said, "Welcome to Port-au-Prince." My mother has ideas about men and women. When a woman lives with a man before they are married, my mother believes that she is engaged in a concubinage. This sort of arrangement upsets her greatly. Michael and I pretended that we were not living together until we married. During our first visit to the motherland, we had to sleep in separate rooms. When Michael realized this, he pulled me aside and said, "Seriously?" I squeezed his arm, kissed his chin. "You will be fine." He pouted. "I can't sleep without you. You've ruined me." "Well, I suppose you won't be getting much sleep then." My mother found us in the hallway, Michael's arms around me on the very tips of my toes, my lips pressed against the hollow of his neck. She cleared her throat and we pulled apart, an uncomfortable heat spreading through my face and scalp. My parents do not know me as someone who is open with her affection. They do not know who I am when I am with Michael. Thank you.
As I was reading, as I was reading the story, you know, Mary starts out strong, and she's going to fight them off, and she's going to survive. And
Yes.
there's this something happens to her by spending time with these kidnappers, and she undergoes sexual rape and abuse, not just once, but maybe several times a day, probably for 13. Am I giving away too much? 13 days?
No, all the reviews
They all talk about that?
are having a free-for-all with the plot.
Yeah, with the plot, yeah. So, well, so some of the work I've done has been with the surviving comfort women of World
Yes.
War II, and they have shared very similar stories of rape and abuse and the slow loss of identity, of personal identity, and that's something that really gripped me with the novel and the way she starts to refer to herself as no one, right?
Yes.
So one of the things that the comfort women told me when I heard their stories and I started to feel physically ill was that the stories enter the body, and that I found that writing was a way to expel those stories from the body. And I wondered maybe if you could talk a little bit about your own process and discovering her story and then having to document it, and if the stories entered your body in any way.
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot about sexual violence in women throughout the world and how all too often women are used as political capital. And we can see that right now in Nigeria. But we can also see that here in the United States and, frankly, every country throughout the world. And so I wanted to write this story of a woman who doesn't realize that her life was a fairy tale until that fairy tale is shattered in ways that she couldn't possibly have ever imagined. And so I did go to a very dark place when I was writing the novel, but I felt that this needed that kind of honesty, and I wanted to stare the violence directly in the face, and I wanted to write it so that it wasn't pretty or aesthetic or stylish in the way that you often see in movies. I wanted to make it so that you had to stop, that you had to pause and really think about what was happening to her, both physically and emotionally. She does, at some point in the novel, start to try and erase herself just so she can survive. And I think that's something that many people try to do to overcome this kind of trauma. So definitely, it definitely entered my body, and then I would just have to take time and just walk away and watch something ridiculous so that I wouldn't be entirely depressed. It was,
Right.
I wrote it in a summer, and it was a dark summer.
You wrote it in one summer?
Yes.
Oh, man. Because I know that they were just writing those stories, you need to take a break. You need to step away. And then I also remember you telling me that you wrote this novel, and it was born of one of the stories in your collection, right? But also, you're actually documenting this phenomenon, this thing with this kidnapping for ransom that is actually widespread throughout, throughout the world, really.
Yes.
And I wonder if you could, you were saying, I'm writing about this, and at the same time, people are going to think I'm writing about a personal story, and it's not a personal story. It's actually this phenomenon. Could you talk a little bit about why you chose to tell this story in a fictional manner rather than nonfiction?
Absolutely. I definitely think there are people who can do that kind of nonfiction chronicle, but I didn't want to co-opt anyone's story. I didn't want to take their story. And so I wrote a novel. This is entirely fiction. And whenever a woman writes this kind of novel, people want to sort of explore her dark past and think that she's projecting something. But I'm actually a fiction writer, and I make things up for fun. I mean, this isn't the funnest book, but it's entirely fiction, and I thought fiction would be the best way to do it. I was really inspired by Alice Walker's Possessing the Secret of Joy, which is also a deeply political novel about female genital mutilation in Africa. It's a sequel to The Color Purple. And I think it's one of the most beautiful books ever written because there is undoubtedly a political line that runs all the way through the novel, but it's still a beautiful work of fiction. It's a crafted novel. And I wanted to do that here. I wanted to talk about how poverty can make people do evil and desperate things, and how people who are unwittingly contributing to that poverty are the victims of that sometimes. I'm very fascinated by this sense that how desperate do you have to be to steal someone from their life and turn to violence? Now, the violence is something separate from the kidnapping. Because it's a novel, the commander, who's the head of the kidnappers, he's just a criminal. I mean, he's a terrible person, and he would be a terrible person wherever, and there's no excuse for that. But as I wrote the novel, I wanted to explore both sides. What is it like to be the aggressor, and what is it like to be the victim?
And I wonder, you say this is totally fiction, but did you have to do some kind of research to kind of get your mind around this entire situation? And also, you don't just tell the story from a superficial perspective, obviously. You go deep into her psyche. So, you really do.
I do.
So I'm wondering, did you feel like you had to research any of that, or is it completely born of
it's just completely
that mind of yours?
Born from the mind of mine. I did research sort of the physical after effects of an experience like this, absolutely, because I wanted to do right by the bodily experience that people go through. But everything else I made up. Everyone keeps asking that, and they're so sad about the answer. But I'm like, yeah, I kind of just imagined it. But I'm totally normal and happy.
And sweet.
Yeah. Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
So I didn't want to do too much research because, again, I also didn't want to unwittingly borrow someone else's story, because that really drives me crazy when writers co-opt someone's story, especially to tell these tragedies like we are the people who can best mediate someone's experience. I don't think we're that person necessarily. I think we can help give people tools and teach people to write their own stories, but I just wanted to make sure I was doing this as a novel. And also, I'm a Haitian American, and so I have a very distant understanding of Haiti. And I just didn't feel I would have the right to approach it in nonfiction.
So let me ask you another question. I'm always telling my students in the classroom that we have these artistic choices that we make. They're strategic choices. They're there to support or enhance the intentions of the work. And I noticed that the book is told from several perspectives, first person, third limited, and I think at times even omniscient. And so I was wondering, for those writing students out there, could you talk a little bit about those choices and why you went that direction? Well,
the original draft of the novel was written entirely in first person. I really felt like you needed that intimacy, and you needed to feel what Miri experienced. And I wanted it to be intense, and I wanted it to be inescapable. And then my editor, Amy Hunley, who's amazing, said, "This is claustrophobic." And I said, "Yes, that's what I'm going for." And she was like, "No." And so I created the third-person sections for a couple reasons. One, to give the reader a break and to air the narrative out a little bit. But I also wanted to show the ways in which Mireille is unreliable after the trauma, she is completely out of her mind.
Right.
And so she can't really be trusted, and it's not her fault, but I wanted to be able to show some of the things that she's experiencing from other people's points of view. And while she was kidnapped, I also wanted to give the reader a sense of what was happening within her family.
Yeah, and I noticed that because it's such a high and intense experience that she's going through, that you also definitely use like flashback and those third person kind of limited,
Yes.
just to give us a break.
Absolutely. The flashbacks are, again, to soften, because I know how dark the novel gets. And I'm not here to traumatize the reader. I do want it to be realistic, but I'm not trying to make you sort of take to a dungeon. And so I definitely use the flashbacks to temper it, to show that there is hope, and to maybe forecast or foretell that there would be hope by the end of the novel as well.
Right. So I'm going to ask one more question, and then I think I'm going to open it up to the audience, right? And we have, this is the mic that they would use, I guess, maybe? I don't know. There's a mic out there for the audience. All right, so heads up, this is my last question. And it has, and this is, I'm going to step away from the novel for a second. I'm so interested in and profoundly grateful to you as a writer of color, because you have been doing some great work out there to get reviewers and readers to look at the work of writers of color. And I think it's interesting that in this day and age, we still have to fight that battle. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why you've taken that on and how's that battle going?
Well, I think the battle's going great today. I don't want to be the exception, I want to be the rule. And so when I started noticing that I was the only person of color in a lot of these publications, I realized that I need to share the ladders that I've used to get where I am. And so I have just made it my mission until I see 5 or 6 writers of color, and not just black writers, by the way, because there happen to be other colors and races and ethnicities. This crusade is never going to end, and a lot of times people think that they let 1 or 2 of us in the door and they've done their job and they're very proud of themselves. But no, their work is not done. They have to create opportunities for all kinds of writers. It's very easy for me to be where I am. I was raised in a loving household by amazing parents. I was educated at the top schools. It's not surprising. I mean, I work hard, don't get me wrong, but this is not a surprise. How do we get people who don't have those advantages to get this kind of recognition? And how do we get reviewers? Like, there was a review yesterday of an anthology called Long Hidden, and one of the stories is written in African American vernacular English, and the reviewer said that it was a literary trick. And that just shows how much we need diversity in literature, because that's not a literary trick. That was someone telling a story in as truthful a way as he thought he wanted to tell that story. And because we have such a lack of diversity in how books are reviewed and who is reviewing books, and quite frankly, who is editing and producing these books, we are going to have ignorant comments like that in reviews. And so the work is endless, and we've made a little progress, but it's staggering how much work is left to be done.
Can you just share just a little bit, how do we go about that work of creating diversity in literature? I mean, what's one thing that people out there can do to support that?
Well, publishers need to put money where their mouths are. They have to stop saying diversity and having like diversity balls, and they need to start hiring diverse editors. Sorry, it's true. You know, I look at my publishers. I'm at 2 really great publishing houses, HarperCollins and Grove Atlantic, and I've never seen a black editor in either building. So I think that's a problem. And I think that, you know, we also need to get more publicists of color. And so the writers are out there, and so we need to start putting people in the machine who understand where to go to find these writers, and who are willing to work with these writers when they're not as well prepared as people who have had every advantage in life.
Awesome. Thank you, Roxane. I wanted to open it up to our lovely audience here at Books and Books and see if anyone has a question.
Let's do this.
Do we have a microphone?
Following up on what you just said, so what role would colleges, high schools play in order to encourage students of color to write, to talk about their own personal experiences, to get this, to move it forward from that level?
High school and college is too late. You have
It
to
is, oh.
Absolutely. You need to start sooner. You need to start in kindergarten. You need to start in preschool. You need to start in 1st and 2nd and 3rd grade. It has to be constant, and it has to be always. By the time I teach college writing, and by the time they get to me, I oftentimes have students who can't string a sentence together. Why is that? I mean, I can help them, but it's heartbreaking. And there's only so much you can do to get them where they need to be when they come with such deficiencies. And so we need to be encouraging students at every stage of the educational process. At the high school and college level, you have to respect the stories, even if they don't fit the narrative that you want. Oftentimes, students of color are expected to tell a certain kind of story. When I first started writing, a lot of times people would say, I'm not sure this is a black story. And I was like, well, I grew up in Nebraska. This is as black as it gets.
They would tell you that it wasn't a black enough story?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. I'm from the suburbs. And so, you know, there is a black middle class. And so you have to be open to those kinds of stories. You have to be open to the grittier stories from people who might be from inner cities. And you have to also teach the other students how to read those stories, because diversity is not just about the writing, it's about how people read and embrace those stories, and that they're open to those stories without rolling their eyes or thinking that they can analyze or explain that experience away. So I think that's definitely just be open to it. You're welcome. Yeah.
I was thinking about the question of the difference between the rapidity of the reaction time that you do now all the time because something will occur, whether it's a movie that's just come out or whether it's a an event, and you're writing very rapidly, really good
Thanks.
essays, but you're trying to get a grip on it, versus the kind of reaction time in writing fiction, trying to understand and writing drafts and so on. How do you do the fast one, and how do you manage not to do the fast one when you're writing fiction?
Well, I'm an insomniac, and I live in the...
I know that because I'm too, and I'm
And I live in the middle of nowhere, so I have a lot of free time to, you know, respond quickly. With a lot of the issues that come up, I've already been thinking about something related to that. So like when Paula Deen happened, I had long been thinking about Paula Deen and like, oh my God, can you believe this thing? Like this woman cooks with butter constantly and she's alive. It's amazing. And so I know, and lying very well. And so I have, I think, a foundation within which to respond to the zeitgeist. In terms of my fiction, fiction is my happy place, and so I definitely go there to take my time and to really relax and to sink into a story. The grind of being a cultural critic and having to respond can get very wearing, and you worry that you're responding to everything, and if you respond to everything, then how can you stand for anything? And so I do try to be as thoughtful as possible. But I think another reason it's easier to respond quickly is because I'm struggling with the questions that everyone else is struggling with. And I don't have definitive answers. You know, I don't understand why Robin Thicke's music is so catchy, but he's still such an asshole. And so right? I mean, it's just facts. And so I need to think about that. And it's easy for me to write those essays quickly because these are actually things that I'm thinking. And there's just no filter there, obviously.
Why do you write about Haiti, and what does it mean to you to be Haitian American?
I write about Haiti because my parents are Haitian, and I've always been raised understanding that I'm Haitian, and Haitian identity has been an integral foundation of who I am. I think it's what has given me my confidence, and it has given me my place in the world. I think in the United States, oftentimes when you're black, you're unmoored, and you don't know where you belong, but I have always known exactly where I belong. And so when I write about Haiti, I'm definitely trying to make sense of how did I get so lucky as a Haitian American when so many people are not. And you know, it's just my way of making sense of identity. And I'm always clear to make sure that I'm only one person, and I'm not telling the story of Haiti by any means. I'm telling a story, the same way any other writer is telling a story about a place.
You have this really lovely poetic delivery when you read.
Oh, thank you.
And I'm wondering if that's how you hear the story.
Definitely. I'm afraid of public speaking. So, great, by the way. Thank you. And so when I write, I hear it in a cadence, absolutely. There is a music to the words. And so when I'm reading them, that's exactly how I hear it. And sometimes when I write, I catch myself doing this, and I'm like, oh, thank God I live alone. Because if someone saw this, they would be calling a doctor. But I'm okay. Yes?
Pharrell and Marvin Gaye are what made Blurred Lines so catchy.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very true.
But I'm interested in something that you said earlier. You didn't quite phrase
Mm-hmm.
And I'm really interested in, there recently was a study about a quarter of all men who have been in a war zone have been victims of sexual abuse.
Mm-hmm.
But that story doesn't escape. That's in the dark hole
Yes.
of masculine myth. And I'm wondering, you know, how we negotiate a point where, you know, women get to own their own bodies, but men get to see that, you know, we don't always own our own bodies either. There's something, maybe that's one of the reasons why men are so well tattooed, because it really is, you know, a way of claiming their own bodies.
Absolutely. Tattoos are very much a way of saying this skin is mine and I'm going to take it back. I think that it's going to take a long time for men to get to that place and for women to get to that place. And it's the statistics about men and sexual violence are really quite, as victims of sexual violence, are quite startling. And there's so much shame because of masculinity, and so few men come forward, and our society is not willing to hear these men's stories. And so until we find ways of reducing the shame of coming forward for both men and women, I think we're going to have a hard time with men understanding that their bodies are, in certain times and places, as vulnerable as the bodies of women. In terms of women owning their bodies, I mean, we need to get to a place where a woman can walk down the street without being catcalled simply because a man feels like sharing his attraction. There's a sense of entitlement to the female body. The female body is oftentimes a public text, and we also see this in terms of legislation over and over again. As long as our legislative leaders continue to believe that they can legislate the female body, it's no mystery that the average person walking down the street also feels the same way. We are following those who lead us. And so I think that we just need systemic change before any of this is going to get better.
Can I just point out this a moment in the book that just horrified me? It was when she finally got to go home. She gets to go home, and it's there are three men that greet her, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's her father,
Yes, her father,
her husband, and the negotiator.
Yes.
And she's been under. She must physically look like a wreck.
Yes.
And she has asked for one thing, and that is to take a shower,
Mm-hmm.
and that is not to go to the doctor. She has said, I do not want to go to the doctor. And after all that time away, she goes from one set of captors to another.
Yeah, the men think they know best, and like they want to do right, and they want to follow the rules, and so they don't want to listen to her, and they just do what they were going to do all along. And she's extremely, like, that's what really sort of kindles the rage that was bubbling during her kidnapping. Mm-hmm. That here she is, and she has asked for one thing, and like that her mother wasn't even there when she was released.
Right.
I mean, there's just a lot there.
And it's interesting where she goes to seek her solace, too.
Yes,
that
absolutely.
I won't give away.
Haha.
You'll have to read that.
Yes, you will. $16.
How much time do we have?
Go right ahead.
All right. Are there other questions? Yeah.
I have one more question about, and it's not, it has nothing to, I don't think it has anything, I haven't read your novel, but the idea that victims in Haiti, particularly kidnappings, are upper class women, and this is their stories are being told, their stories of being captives and this whole class conflict, but the other captives, the other victims, their stories are not being told.
No.
The women who work in households and who are raped repeatedly by these upper class men or whatever, you know, their victimhood is not as publicized or as bemoaned as that of these women. I just wanted to point that out.
Yes, I do bring that up in the novel. I don't take it up as much as I could, but simply because I didn't know enough. And I could definitely write a novel about that, but that's not the story I wanted to write. But absolutely, I think that the class distinction does not make the violence worse. That was just a story I was best equipped to write.
Can I say something to that? Just because I teach at FIU, I teach Asian American and every kind of writer. It's one of the great things about teaching in Miami. And I've actually seen some of the stories that you're interested in bubbling up with people who are learning the craft.
Mm-hmm.
They want to write those stories. They know those stories. Sometimes it's their mother's story, things like that. So some of it is the stories are there to be told. So that issue of publishing and what publishing
Absolutely.
respond to is a really crucial one.
Yes, those stories are going to continue. They need to be told, and they deserve to be told. There's actually a book coming out this summer about Haitian women and violence. and I can't remember the publisher, but it looks at violence across all classes, and it's a nonfiction book.
Where is this systemic change going to come from?
Hillary Clinton. I don't know. I really don't know.
Follow-up question.
Yes.
Do you identify with modern American and European feminism? Is there a place for you there?
Absolutely. I refuse for there not to be a place for me there. I think that contemporary feminism has oftentimes had very little to do with women of color, but I believe in the equality of women throughout the world, and I think that women should be free of oppression. And I'm not going to throw out the baby with the bathwater just because feminism has issues. I think the core ideals of feminism still matter. And so I've created my own place within contemporary feminism. And they can get on board or they can just get left behind.
The play by Vagina Monologues is quite widely influenced by like gang rape situations in warlike situations. I was wondering if that had any effect if you'd seen it.
I have seen the Vagina Monologues several times. They first did it, I think, when I was in college, and I saw that. That's the first time I saw it. My school does it every year at the university where I teach. But it wasn't something I was thinking about when I wrote this. All right.
Any other questions? We have her here for one night only. She flies off to Chicago tomorrow, yeah.
What was that you didn't like the help of the book or the movie?
Sure, I can expound all over that. The help. So in the book, Catherine Stockett.
Are you standing up?
I almost was. Like, let me tell you about the help. In the book, Catherine Stockett has Aibileen refer to herself as black as a cockroach. I have known black people refer to themselves as many different things, but we do not refer to our skin color in terms of insects. And so it just showed a lack of care and a lack of an ethical code in terms of how she was writing difference as an upper-class white woman. And then in the story and in the movie, it's a young, sorry, it's my niece. It's a young white girl named Skeeter who's going to help all these older black women find salvation. And I think it's absurd. That's just the biggest wish fulfillment of Jackson, Mississippi in the 1960s that I've ever heard of. It's literally like this book takes place on another planet. And what's particularly infuriating is that the movie's really well done. It's beautifully produced. It's beautifully acted. I mean, this was a product that people cared about. But it overlooked so much of reality. It overlooked the Jim Crow. I mean, and speaking of sexual violence and people in the working class, I mean, these were women who were subjected to sexual violence in the home every single day. Not every woman, of course, but it was definitely there. And that movie makes it seem like, yeah, it wasn't so bad to be in 1960s Mississippi. It was very, very bad, unless you were white. And even then, it kind of was terrible to be a woman. And the book it was just delusional. But it's just my opinion.
It's also very similar to what you can see in Haiti or Latin America, with still having help and things like that.
Yes, and the thing is, I don't have an issue with the help part. I have a housekeeper. I just don't. Look, I work hard. I'm not cleaning my house. But I do think that in certain cultures there is this help narrative. There's just help class, and we're familiar with that. And the help does harken back to that. And frankly, it's still there in the South. And especially among the upper classes where people have household help. I don't mind that. I don't want people to rewrite history. I want them to actually talk about history as it was and not be so selective. And that book was extraordinarily selective. Yeah.
I'm Southern heritage,
Okay.
and so is my family, and I hated it. I
Ah.
thought it was so unrealistic. And in fact, my nephew and his family live in the place.
Mm-hmm.
And we were there in 1986, something like that, for their wedding.
Mm-hmm.
And my husband threatened to gag me if I said anything because of just the way that their health was treated.
Ah.
It was a gorgeous home, lots of lovely parties, and I wanted to scream.
I can imagine.
And so I thought she wrote a book to make a movie. and to make money.
Yes.
The end of story. And she did not live there. She has no idea what was going on. I mean, I was a young girl, and we had help in our, and my mother, had separate dishes for our black maid. And I said to her, you let this person take care of your children, and you won't let her eat out of our dishes. But that was the mindset, the Southern bigoted mindset. Sorry if I'm insulting anyone. But so I hated it. I agree the movie was beautifully made, but I thought, well, I just wanted to smack her.
I'm hoping.
Let's do this book.
I'm hoping. But I will also say,
Producers here?
I will also say that racism is a global problem.
Yes. Oh, absolutely.
I live in the Midwest, and I've spent most of my life in the Midwest, and I assure you there is nothing going on in the South that is not going on in every other part of this country. It just looks different and sounds different at times. But I really appreciate you sharing that.
Not just this country.
No.
Travel abroad, yes.
Yeah.
South America, and it's not great there.
No, it's a shame. We just, we're all human, but we still, in 2014, have not figured out how to be human together. And that's unfortunate. Yes.
I've read some things lately that have caused me to start to wonder if men are not by nature rapists.
Oh, huh.
That if, under the right circumstances, any man would be capable of raping. I mean, we know just from recent developments, and this was a shock to me, that rape is not just something that occasionally happens during war, but it is actually it's a tool of war.
Yeah, I don't think that at all. I know far too many amazing men. I think that either you have that ability or you not, but I don't think it's something inherent.
Oh my God, I'm marrying you.
Good luck.
What did you just say?
No, I understand where that question comes from, and quite frankly, there are days when I watch too much Law and Order, SVU, or frankly, I just read the news and I just think, what is going on? But no, I refuse to believe that. I can't believe that. I was raised by a good man. My brothers are good men. I have dated good men. I just know too many good men to believe that it's an inherent to the male psyche to be a rapist. But all too often, I think that rape is used as a tool because women are considered second-class citizens. And I think it's more the state of women than it is the state of men that creates this use of sexual violence as a tool of war.
And the permission that we've given men to do
Whatever.
Yeah.
And to note that men rape men. So, it's that I find the phrase command and control keeps coming up in my mind in innumerable circumstances. The recent stuff about all the universities with, the cases, which only because there's people who have gone to the federal government, and that's actually been mostly in more elite schools where there are people empowered enough to know they can go to the federal government, but believe me, it's everywhere. And what you see is there's a set of people, and it's not true on the internet too, who will use abuse and threat of rape as a kind of, shut you up kind of tactic, or drive you away kind of tactic, but it's by no means the majority. But you only need a few terrifying people to terrify you.
Yes. And only a few people can do quite a lot of damage.
It starts when kids are young.
Yes.
I volunteered at the state of New Jersey as a women's shelter in every county, and worked in a women's building, volunteered for them. And the first thing they do when they bring a woman in, if the children, male children, put them in counseling, they think that's how women should be treated, and they talk back to their mother and push, and aggressive, and so it starts with babies. Know that they're treated well and they need to treat each other.
Yes.
How do we find your blog?
That's a good question.
I can't tell you that right now because my parents are here. RoxaneGay.com. You're welcome.
Yeah, I'm interested in this conversation, but I wonder, where do the jagged edges of sexual fantasy interlock with responsibility, I guess is the word that I'm looking for there, because we all have very active sex fantasy lives.
I don't know what you're talking about.
And people keep talking about the availability of pornography somehow or another, perverting the way that we sexualize we fantasize about sex. But I was a teenage boy before there was an internet, and I can guarantee you there's been very little change in the intervening years. So that sexual fantasies are really a part of who we are.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, there's got to be some place where you can have that fertile sexual fantasy, and yet at the same time, understand. I don't know what I'm saying at this point, but I'm interested in.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that there's a continuum. I think there's fantasy and there's reality. And I also think that anything goes so long as there is consent. I'm not here to police your sex life. Do what you want to do. I mean, if you like it a little rough, by all means, I support you. But you have to have a willing partner. And the beauty of fantasy is that anything goes. And that you have that safety to explore the things that we're told not to explore and to explore the things that are taboo. I do think porn is different from fantasy. Porn is nothing like fantasy. Porn is soulless and depressing. And I don't care if you watch it. I don't judge it. But I mean, I think it desensitizes and it makes people think that bodies are just bodies and they're objects and not inhabited by actual people. And so I think there's a very big distinction between pornography and fantasy, because in fantasy there's always a very vibrant and alive person involved, generally the self. And in pornography, it's women and men as objects and doing all kinds of things, I hear. And
Because your parents are in the audience.
correct. Well, I've heard about this pornography thing once or twice, but I'm a good girl. I think that there's a difference. And I think what we have to worry about is the desensitization and what people see in pornography and assume that pornography is reality. Because I do think that there are young men and women who look at pornography and think, oh, I have to shave myself completely. And no, you don't. And I have to sort of put my feet by my ears. And they just don't know how to draw the line. And so a lot of it comes with also better sex education. So that we're educating young people to understand the difference between fantasy, pornography, and reality.
Any more questions? Last question is two more questions. Chauncey and the lady down there.
Go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted to ask, in your research, did you find, you talk about women of color, Black, Caribbean Black, Asian, white. Was any one group utilized more, rate more than pretty straightforward across?
I didn't look at statistics like that, but in my overall work, especially in my nonfiction work, I will say that there is no one group that is more subjected to sexual violence than any other. It's truly a universal issue. And you'll see similar rates of violence in many countries, unless there's a war. And then oftentimes, when they had the war in Bosnia, that was used as a tool to sort of breed out the undesirable. And so you'll see flare-ups like that during certain global conflicts. But no, there's absolutely no correlation between race and ethnicity and sexual violence.
I understand that you're a master of social media. I'm not, so I have to take the general word for it. So I was wondering, given the fragmentation of the attention span brought about by modern, 21st century digital media, are you optimistic about the future of literature?
Absolutely. I think it's hilarious that this generation has the audacity and the arrogance to think that we're going to destroy the book when the book has been around for millennia. Back in the day, and I'm like talking about BC, people were using rice paper and like weird little inks that they made from berries. And we think that we're somehow going to make that go away because we've shortened our attention spans. Absolutely not. I think literature is going to continue to be vibrant, and it's going to continue to be wonderful. I think how we consume literature is changing. And I think that the attention span issue is going to come to a head because we're going to get to a point where people can't function and do anything but sort of stare what do I do? I don't know, read a book. I think it's going to be okay. I'm very optimistic, but I have to be because I'm a writer, and I want to write another book, and I want someone to read it.
I'll read it.
Thank you.
I'll read it. I'll read it. And I hope you guys read her book, right? So go pick up a book and have her sign it. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm reminded of a quote by Richard Price. He says, "What's this about the novel being dead? The novel will show up to your funeral." Anyway, if there are no more questions, folks, then we have Untamed State, as well as some of Evelina Galang's books for sale at the counter over there. Roxane's going to be signing at the table there to the left of the stools. A reminder for our internet audience, there's still time for you to call the number on your screen, buy Untamed State, and we'll get it signed and shipped to you. And also a reminder that all of our live streamed events are archived, so you can visit the Books and Books website, go to the live streaming link, and any author appearance we broadcast from here will be saved there for you to watch at your convenience. And this was such an interesting discussion. Please, let's give Evelina and Roxane another hand.